Well, welcome back. We've been looking at the foster care crisis before, during, and throughout. We've been looking at the foster care crisis generally. And I don't know about you, but one of the questions I ask a lot in these kinds of conversations is, so what? When I've been listening and thinking about all of the conversations we've had so far, I think about this professor I had, and his name is Bob Bain in grad school. And he used to listen to me wax eloquently, at least I thought I was, about how to solve the great challenges of our day. And he would get as close as I am to this microphone away from my face. And he would say, "That is beautiful, Ryan. But how are you going to do that? How are you going to do that?" And we have certainly heard really compelling stories and convicting, inspirational things from our guests so far. And that will still be true today. And along the way, we've tried to equip you in the show notes and at possibleandlikely.com with resources where you can take the next step or learn more about the guests related to the phase that we've been in before, during, after, and throughout foster care. But today we want to deep dive into what's next. What's next? What are next steps that you can take? We're going to look at discernment. We're going to look at grassroots foster care ministry. We're going to look at bringing your concerns and questions to the light, things that you're thinking and you feel like, is that okay for me to ask? We're going to explore some of those things today. And as we've been thinking about how to round out this Possible and Likely podcast, we thought of our friend Cindy King. I can't think of anyone better to help us wrestle through the what's next. What are the next steps to take? Because Cindy and her husband, John, have been involved in foster care for quite a while. They've adopted, they've done foster care. They have launched a adoption consulting business. They've started ministries in their church and in the community. They just love freely, and they have made an impact not only on their own family and their own children, but on countless others, including me. There's little doubt in my mind that I don't think I would be involved in caring for vulnerable kids if I didn't have Cindy and John's example. And so at least staying involved. John and Cindy have kept me in the game for a while. So I just am so excited for you and for us to spend some time together exploring next steps, because the thing I want to focus on as we frame this time is I don't know what your next step is. And your next step will be different than my next step. And as we think about having more than enough before, during, and after foster care, the question we want to encourage you to ask is to ask the Lord, what is my next step? How do I take a next step? And the thing I love about Cindy King is she has gotten to do so many incredible things, has impacted so many incredible stories. But I know her well enough to know that she doesn't believe that that's by her own doing. She never could have imagined the impact that she's had. But she regularly asks, Lord, like, what do you want us to do with the things that you've done? What do you want me to do with my time, my attention, my heart? And what's my next step? And be faithful to that. And then God has written a story grander than she probably could have hoped for. I know that to be true. And we're just so honored and delighted that she could be with us today. So Cindy, thanks for coming.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
We're really excited to talk to you. And thanks for your time here and just your time, well, certainly putting up with me. So thanks.
That's easy.
It's been rough. Rough.
Well, Lord knows. Lord knows. So yeah, thanks for coming.
Yeah. So I think just to frame the episode here, I think we'd love to hear some of your story of your family, of you and John's journey, and then from there we'll dive into some other things. But so what is your story with foster care? How did you and John know that that was the path to take, and how has that led you to this point where you're at now?
Okay, that's a question that could take a long time.
Yes, you could write a whole book about that, I'm sure. Maybe multiple.
And maybe we'll do that someday.
Someday. Add it to the list.
Yeah. So your introduction was very humbling because as my husband often refers to me as the little Mennonite girl from Eastern Pennsylvania, who would have ever guessed that I would be sitting here being interviewed for a podcast? But growing up that little Mennonite girl from Eastern Pennsylvania, my story, I think, into foster care started when my best friend's family became a foster family. And this was a family that had very little material wealth of their own. And I don't think I fully understood at the time what all they sacrificed to take in the children that they brought into their home. This was in the 80s. And so it was the time of the HIV crisis and what were called the HIV babies that nobody wanted because everyone was afraid to bring that into their homes. But this family brought those children into their homes. I did not know that at the time because that would have not been possible for them to share that. But later, as an adult, I learned that. And part of that was because my friend's father had hemophilia and had contracted HIV/AIDS.
Wow.
Again, I did not know that at the time.
Right.
But because their family knew about it already, they were willing to do what they needed to do to help these children out. So I watched that family. I also come from a large extended family that is very much about giving and serving others. And I credit my grandparents with a lot of the why behind what we have done. I have several cousins that have adopted at this point, and I truly believe that it was the example of our grandparents that allowed us to be welcoming to other people and to people that come from different cultures, from different backgrounds, from different neighborhoods. So when John and I were dating, I told him about this plan that I had of adopting and doing foster care. And also because I had an interest in special needs and my major was elementary and special education, I told him that the plan was that we would foster and or adopt multiple children with special needs. And John could tell you his side of it, but since he's not here, I will tell you his side of it,
Go ahead.
which was that he said no, this was not something that was in his future. So I tried one more thing, and I gave him one of my favorite books about a family that did adopt 18 or so children with special needs. And he read it to his credit, but again, he closed that book and said, no, we're not doing this. And I look back and I still can't believe that neither one of us got up and left the relationship and said, well, this isn't going to work. If he's not going to parent foster children and if that's what she thinks she's doing, I'm out of here. But God must have helped that to work out together. And then God's sense of humor came into play because John graduated from college with a degree in psychology and sociology, and there's not a whole lot you can do with just a bachelor's. And so while he was working on his master's, his first job out of college was as a foster care social worker.
Come on.
And
Look at God.
Look at God. And his first day on the job, he was taken by his mentor caseworker to the hospital to pick up a very tiny baby who had been born very prematurely, APGAR scores of 0 and 0, which if you know what that means, it means this child should not have lived.
Yep.
Drug involvement at birth, and he was part of taking her to her foster home. And he came home that day and just said, watching that foster mom wrap her arms around this baby that she was going to love no matter what, that started to change his heart. And then we went through a period of time of infertility, so that changed his heart as we went through the adoption process. We did have biological children, so then we've done foster care off and on for about 25 years. And it was a slower process for John to come to that point, but God definitely had his hand in it, and we can see that. And there have been many times along the way where it's just been praying, okay, God, what do you want us to do in this situation? Or what is the next step for us? We just recently had closed our home to foster care and switched to working with safe families. And that was another God story. Every part of the process has been a God story.
That's awesome. Yeah. And I just think I think we get overwhelmed by all of the what ifs. And I think your guidance to us, just as we focus on what's next, I was just asking that, like, what is my next my next right step? It's amazing they pay me to talk for a living. So I
You're
think
doing great. Keep going.
Yeah, thanks. And I just think that's so helpful. And I think that that's the main thing we want people to hear today, even as we dive deeper into this, because like, what's your next step? And your story is going to be different.
Yes.
And everyone's stories are going to be different. And if all of us wait on the Lord and then do what he asks us to do, it will be different, but we will have more than enough before, during, and after foster care. Yeah.
Could you talk a little bit about the Zoom sessions you've been doing during the pandemic?
Yes. So we have a special needs child who, when the pandemic started, was 6 years old. And in our home, I watched this child who has experienced trauma as an infant. He is adopted. It was a nightmare experience. And at the same time was talking to other families of children who had been fostered or adopted who were saying the same things. And also families who didn't have children with special needs or who had come from backgrounds of trauma. But in the families where there already was trauma, the trauma was so magnified. I watched these families stuck at home with very little support.
That's right.
Even the support they had before, now being afraid to support because now we're being told don't go near anybody, don't leave your home, don't go into anyone else's home. I watched these families drowning, and knowing how my own family was doing, I understood. And so I don't remember who brought up the conversation first, whether it was Ryan or me or Renee or who it was, but somebody said, what can we do? And somehow the idea of having Zoom support sessions came up. And so we started it probably 2 months after the quarantine had started. And I've heard from many parents how helpful that was. It's in the evening, so it was easy to put, well, I shouldn't say easy, but it was often helpful to put the children to bed and then just come on for an hour. And just, I think many times just knowing you're not the only one is really the only support you need at the moment.
Yeah.
You know, there was nothing I could really do for them through the internet, but just to say, I'm praying for you, to pray there, to be able to share. And again, to hear that we're not alone, that there are other people in the same place. And so we're going to just take from God what we can, and we're going to go on to the next day and the next day and the next day.
That's right. And I knew that we struck a chord when we started that, when you and others would do, you continue to be like the staple, and then you'd bring in other people. But when people were staying, the content would be like an hour. And then people were staying for 2-3 hours after, talking and chatting among themselves. It was like, oh, wow. Like even with all the Zoom we're doing, that these were people in their community, even if they never met before, living similar lives. They weren't alone.
Yes.
That was really helpful. So as you think about, we just touched briefly on all the different things you've been involved in, and just a cursory thing. And I do hope that you write a book someday. And you do have a blog. Do you want to plug your blog, or not so much?
I can.
Sure.
It's not as active because I'm very active.
It is so good though, and is so real and truthful and hopeful, but honest.
Okay, so it probably doesn't follow any blog rules because it's a very long title. But
we'll put it in the show notes. People will just
That's
click
a
on
good
it.
idea.
Yeah.
That's a good idea.
Yeah, but yeah,
So I wanted the King Zoo because that's what we call ourselves.
The King Zoo.
The King Zoo, but that was taken.
Fitting. Yeah.
And then I often say to the kids when I'm in one of those, I don't know if I can do this anymore moments, that's it, I'm leaving, I'm going to the funny farm. So then I wanted the funny farm, but that was already taken.
Oh
so
my gosh.
it's the King Zoo and funny farm.
That's awesome.
.blogspot.com.
That's awesome.
Yeah, we will put it in the link, but anytime, it's not, you don't avoid hard things, but you write with honesty, humor, and you just have a real gift for wit. You're like I think John, I don't know what John would describe you as, but you're like you're the secret to the sauce, right? Like you just do the work and you just have this amazing gift of communicating, but you never know that. We've talked about this several times. I love people who do what they were made to do. And you are the kind of person that just like loves well and you don't even think of it. And so, but we aren't giving a lot of detail into all of the things you're doing, but suffice it to say, folks, this is true. You can trust me. She's had a huge impact. Like, what do you think is important to have in grassroots foster care ministry, like in your church or in your community? What are the important ingredients or things that should be involved in that? Because a lot of our listeners and viewers, they're at the beginning. And so as they starting to build and discern, like, what is my next step? What do you think are the important ingredients to have?
So through our own journey, and then also watching the journeys of others and watching this beautiful happening of churches taking up this cause and recognizing that we have a large part to play as a church, I think the biggest thing that's needed is support. and support in every way imaginable. Financial support, emotional support, prayer support. And so what I love about churches who do this ministry is that the support is there. It is who the church is. It's in their DNA. And so that encompasses everyone and everything. And that's beautiful. I've watched churches that don't have a foster care ministry, and I've watched families in those churches struggle and flounder. And then I've watched families in churches that have a foster care ministry, particularly West Shores. And while we all still struggle,
Sure.
it's helpful to know, just like with that Zoom support group, it's helpful to know that there are supports, there are people that care, there are people that are going to be there for you, there are people that are going to walk with you through it. That is the body of Christ, that we all have a part to play. We aren't all called to bring a child into our homes, but then everybody else is called to support families and children in need. And so I think that's the support is the biggest need. And when it comes in a church that from the top down sees that as important, that is so helpful. Just another way that's helpful is in children's ministries. I've had to drop a child off at the children's ministry door saying, I'm only going to give you a first name. And if anyone other than somebody from my family comes to pick up this child, please call 911. Churches need to be prepared for that. They need to know how to handle that.
Right.
That shouldn't be on a foster family's job to at the same time have to explain why or have to go through hoops. Well, we need all of this information. I can't give you this information. I've had to sit down with youth pastors and say, I'm going to have a child coming to your event. You need to make sure that there's 24-hour supervision because this person might leave. This person might have drugs on them. This person might be doing something that would not be something that a typical teenager in your youth group might be doing. I need churches that are going to understand that. Or foster families need churches that are going to understand that and are going to be ready for all that might come. And churches need to understand what trauma looks like, what these children might be bringing into their children's ministries, their youth ministries, what these adults might be bringing into a Sunday morning. That is so important because we want our churches to be welcoming. I think almost every church would say that's what they want, but are we creating that atmosphere? Are we doing the education that needs to be done so that when a family comes in with a child who might not be able to sit through a Sunday school lesson, might swear during the Sunday school lesson. We had one time, an elementary school age child that I remember picking the child up, and I knew where the child was as I walked down the hallway because I heard them swearing up a storm. And I just had to kind of chuckle to myself because maybe not every Sunday school teacher is ready for that, but we need to be. That is the gospel, that we come. I will love you. And you can speak, I call it the language of pain. When children talk to me like that, like, you can speak the language of pain. It's okay. This is where you should be the most welcome. So I do think the support of churches is so important. For families that don't have that, I think it's really important that they find their own support. And I really encourage those families, find a prayer team, find a group of people that can support you with prayer. And hopefully you can also find a group of people, whether it's the same group or a different group, who can support you, that you can send out messages on a regular basis with updates. And, okay, here are the needs I have for this month. Here are the things that we need financially. You know what? I just really need somebody to come mow my lawn because I've been going to so many doctor's appointments this month and I've had so many caseworkers here. I've just not had time to do it. And with an atmosphere that's okay, because we're not people who are good at asking for help, but we need to get there, and we need people who are going to be in our team who are going to say, please stop saying that you don't want to ask for help. That's why I'm here. And that's why God created me, because I'm really good at whatever it is. I'm good at bringing you a meal, or I'm good at cleaning your house, or I'm good at coming and rocking a baby for an afternoon, or whatever it is. These are all ways that people have supported us and helped us. And again, just to know that people care and are supporting you is a big help.
That's awesome. I just want to highlight one thing you said there, that we've seen that to be so true. Like people say, and we'll talk about this in a different episode we did with my wife, Katie, about support teams. And I think that people feel like, oh, I brought this upon myself. If I step into this, I did this. Why should I inconvenience other people? And I think the biggest truth I've found is watching support people say, like, don't deny me the opportunity to be part of what God's called me to. Like, I have been called to come alongside you, and you allowing me to do that allows me to live out the promptings of God in me.
Yes.
And it's not just about you. These are our kids. They happen to live at your house, but these are my kids too. These are our kids. One of our hosts, our support team members, says, we got this placement on this date. Like they're a support team member. So they talk about it like, we got this kid. That's really cool. It's just a really helpful framing of like, they might happen to live at your house, but they're my kids too. They're our kids because these are our kids that God has entrusted us to care for.
Yes.
And I think we've lost that. And we think this will help us get that back.
Yeah. And that comes from a church that has made this an all-encompassing message that we are doing what Jesus has asked us to do, and we do it by all working together.
Yeah, that's right. And the other thing I just want to highlight for all of our listeners is you're stepping forward. I just want to emphasize the trauma piece as well. That some people, when we started our foster care ministry, some people did ask me, like, why are you inviting trauma into our church? And I think that's a fair question. And we need to equip them, and we've tried to do that in a variety of ways. But I also think it's representative of who our neighbors are, where, I serve on this, this group called Inspire, and we're working on 7 strategies to end violence against children. And there's about 2-ish billion kids in the world, but 1.2 billion kids annually experience traumatic abuse against them. So more than half of the world's kids are experiencing abuse. And that's happening in our community too, beyond like they haven't maybe met the foster care threshold, but kids are hurt and then they become adults. So trauma is everywhere, not just in our churches, but in our community, but we just hide it really well within the church. And so we are, I think, stepping into foster care and becoming more trauma informed is good for foster care, but I think it's good for ministry in general to meet the needs of our neighbors.
Yes.
So
my husband, John, is a pastor, and in his office, he has a sign, and I won't be able to give credit where credit is due because I don't know that, but the sign in his office says, trauma is the mission field of our time. And that is very true. And even more so now, after the last year and a half, I've heard several well-known trauma experts recently give the statistic, speaking about children, that we used to say that about 40% of the children in schools have experienced trauma. We now say that 100% of the children in schools have experienced trauma, because if trauma is something that you can't process and you can't understand and it's unpredictable, we've had a lot of that in the last year and a half.
Yeah.
So I do believe that understanding trauma, whether it comes through first learning about it through a foster care ministry or adoption ministry, however you learn about it, we do need to understand the effect of trauma on people, because it does affect their relationships and the way they're going to act and behave. And we see a little bit about ourselves when we learn about trauma.
That's great. I appreciate
really
that.
Powerful.
Yeah, thanks.
So I think now we like transition a little more into addressing our listeners and just as they're entering into this discernment process and trying to see whether God is leading them into this, or not really whether, because we're all called into it, right, in one way or another, but where and how. What should they be paying attention to?
I think the first question is, well, actually, before the first question, I think it's just we each need to understand we are all called to serve the vulnerable in whatever way that is. It doesn't have to look like John and Cindy King. It doesn't have to look like Ryan and Katie. It doesn't have to look like Nate. Whatever that is for you, how is God asking you to serve?
That's right.
I don't think, the question is not, are you being asked to serve? The question is, how are you being asked to serve? And then I think the story in the Bible of what is in your hands is a really good question. What are you good at? I've said to some people, like, you are a beautician, you're a hairstylist, you're a cosmetologist. Like, is there a way you can use that? Absolutely, there's a way you can use that. What about free haircuts to the foster children that you know or that you might connect with? Again, if you're a person that does lawn work, I know of a lot of foster families that could use your help, because that is one of the things that, whether you like it or are good at it or not, when your family is in chaos, that's the bottom of your list.
Oh, yeah.
You might mow because the neighbors will get upset, but everything else is just going to fall by the wayside.
Yeah.
And even I would say the inside of your house and the house cleaning. And my mom and my grandmother, when we lived close to them, were wonderful because they would come once a week and clean my house for me.
Wow.
And that was just such a gift that they gave. I don't think they even saw it as a gift, but what a gift to be able to offer that. So I think, what's in your hands? What did God already give you that you're good at, or that you love, or that you have extra of? That's what you're being asked to give. And that's how you're being asked to give it. Now, the big question, are you being asked to foster or walk into safe families or bring children into your home, bring the trauma into your home? That's a big one. And we've been with a lot of couples that are asking that question. So we have an adoption consulting ministry business, and a lot of the families that sit with us are looking into adoption, but we've had some that are looking into foster care and some that are saying, we're not sure which one we're looking into. I would say 9 times out of 10, one of the couple is very much ready to go, and the other one is not. And I would say most of the time, in our experience, the wife is the one who has a story like mine. I grew up saying I was going to foster or adopt. I read the books, I knew the friends, all of this. And then I brought up this subject with my spouse, and he said, absolutely not, no way. And so my husband tells this story when we're sitting with a couple, and it's not unique to him. He heard it somewhere else, and the person he heard it from probably heard it from someone else. But it's this analogy of the brake and the gas pedal. And so he'll look at a couple, or we'll look at a couple and say, so one of you is probably the brake and one of you is probably the gas pedal. And in our relationship, I have almost always been the gas pedal when it comes to foster care and adoption, and John has almost always been the brake. But John will say, if we were both the gas pedal, we would crash and burn. And in our situation, we would have 30 special needs children, and I probably would be in the funny farm. And we probably would be divorced because that was not what we were called to do. And the special needs we do have are enough that they keep us on our knees, definitely. But I love when I hear John say, if we were both the brake, we would go nowhere. And so it's so important for couples to talk about it together and to pray about it. We've even had some couples that we've encouraged to sit with a counselor for a period of time. Because you can't adopt half or you can't foster half. It's either you're both all in or you're not. And if you're not, that's okay, because then God has called you to something else, and that's fine as well. But if he's calling you to this, he's going to call both of you to this. We've seen, unfortunately, a few situations where one felt the call, the other didn't, but just reluctantly agreed, and it didn't end well. So it does mean both the husband and the wife have to come together. If you're a single person, I say find people that you can sit down with and talk to and pray about it with you. Make sure you have people who are going to support you, because it is something that you're going to need support as you go. Same with the couples. Find people who are going to support you. Find that prayer team even before you start. And when you come to that place where you both have the call and you both know this is the time, and you're not going to have all the questions answered. You're still going to have concerns. You're still going to have some fears. That's okay. I don't think we're ever going to, whenever we take a big step, we're not going to have all of the questions answered. And that's probably a good thing we don't.
Right.
Because if we did, we would not take that step.
Right. Yeah, that's true. That's true. And that's so helpful. The pump and the brakes and the accelerator. I think that's a really helpful analogy. And one fact that I've learned from the Christian Alliance for Orphans, 7 out of 10 women who want to pursue foster care don't, because their husbands are against it. But I have learned, and that's I've seen that play out over and over again. But I don't think that that's always gender the same, because I think your analogy is really good. That it's like one of you is the brake and one of you is the accelerator. I think that's really, really helpful. And I have found over and over again as well that I just want to say to those who are thinking about, like, hey, I have these questions and I have these reservations. That's an important role. too, because this is not for the faint of heart, and there are people who are wanting to go, but it's to redeem their own trauma in a way that they're not ready to do that, and not that any of us are ready, but they're doing it not necessarily for the right reasons yet. That God is beginning maybe to work in them. So as we think about what would you say to the listeners who might be held up by questions or concerns they have about jumping in? What would you say to them? What guidance would you have as they have these pauses? I just don't know about this, or I don't know about that. What guidance would you give them?
So I tell a story about how when I was in high school, my family took a trip across country. And this was supposed to be the last hurrah before I went off to college. I'm the oldest. And one of the stops was in Colorado, and we were to go whitewater rafting. And I'm not a very adventurous person, but about halfway through, they pulled all the rafts to the side and they said, okay, see this cliff up here? Anyone that wants to jump, this is your place to jump. This is a great place. It's safe to jump into the water below. So we'll just take a little break here. Whoever wants to do that can go. And there was no way I was going to do that. But my brother right away said, yeah, I'll go. So I thought, yeah, I'll just follow him up and watch from the top. So I followed him up, and when I got up there, I had this thought, you know what, I'm here. I might as well jump. So I did, actually, before he did. And probably the best way, without thinking. So I just walked off that cliff and jumped. And if you've ever done that, the experience is you go down and 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 down, and you think that's it. I'm done. I need a breath.
What have I done?
What have I done? And then you finally start to come back up. And I think of that so often in the journey. Yeah. So when I think about the questions, my answer is, if God's asking you to jump, jump. He will bring you back to the surface. You may go down and down and down and down and down, but he will bring you back to the surface. And the next cliff will be bigger, and the next one will be bigger, but he doesn't start you on the biggest one. He leads you there gradually, and he provides the people who will support you through that. So I think the biggest question that I hear most often, how could I ever give a child back?
Yep.
How could I pour everything into a child and then have to say goodbye? And I don't think we can answer that question before it happens, other than to say, if God's asked you to jump off that cliff,
that's right,
and the child is going to be reunified, because that is always the goal. And as Christians, I think we have to support that goal 100%. We can't go into foster care with the idea, I'm a better parent. I am going to keep this child. I can offer so much more. We have to go into it praying, God, your will be done. And if that will is that this child is reunified, then you are going to walk with me as I say goodbye. And you are going to provide the people who are going to walk with me through that. And sometimes that is a beautiful process of saying goodbye, but also I'm now your aunt, or I'm now your family friend who is going to support your family. Sometimes it's goodbye. And we don't know what happens on the other side of that.
That's right.
But we have a really neat story of a young woman who came back on her own as a grown woman. And now we get to be the aunt and uncle to her children. And we get to be a support to her family to keep children out of foster care. So I think the jumping off the cliff and trusting is the answer to all the questions. And that seems so simplistic, and it's not. But I don't have a better answer, because how could anybody say goodbye without God's support? And I guess the next question is, how can I deal with the trauma? Once you do know what you could be walking into, then the next question might be, well, how could I do that? I in the beginning, if you had told me that I would have holes in my walls from children that are just so angry that they don't know what to do with it, that's where it goes. If you had told me that I would be calling the police, if you had told me that my life would be threatened by a child in my home, if you had told me these things beforehand, I would not have jumped off the foster care cliff. So it was a matter of God walking us through the first door. And I will say that first door, we call that our Disney World adoption, because that foster care experience was as pain-free as a foster care experience can be. It doesn't happen all the time. But then the next one was a little more difficult. And then the next one was a little more difficult, and a little more difficult. But God took us there as he knew we were ready to go there, as he had provided what we needed to be there. Another question that we hear a lot is, especially from men, and so again, my husband will often address the answer, but that is, how can I love a child that's not my own? And again, I think God provides that.
That's right.
And for me, I don't know how to answer that question, because in almost every case, I've been able to, from the first moment I've seen that child, love that child as if it was my own. But on the days that are hard, the days that it's hard to love a child, one time there was a specific situation where I was really struggling, and we had a meeting with some other people and the child. And I just reached out to my support team and I said, I'm struggling. I don't want to go to this meeting angry with my child. I need to feel love for this child today. Yeah. And one of my support team members just emailed right back, and she said, Cindy, you know what you need to do. You need to go for a run, and you and Jesus need to talk this out, and you need to just ask him for more of his love that you can give to the child. And so that's what I did, and that's exactly right. And that's the reminder I often need to give myself. Go talk to Jesus about it, ask him for his love, and that's how I'm going to do today, and then the next day, and the next day. Because it's not a human love sometimes. It's hard to love a child that's yelling at you, cursing you, threatening you. But Jesus did it. He loved people like that all the time, to his death. And I think the most challenging part of Jesus's ministry for me is that Jesus loved Judas. Jesus invited Judas into his story and he allowed Judas to walk with him and have ministry with him, and then to be betrayed by this person. If Jesus can love like that, then I am asked to that same love. Not on my own. I'm never going to have that on my own. But when I go to Jesus and say, I need that love that you had for Judas, he's going to give it to us.
Yeah. It's good. And love is always that way. But I think that that these moments remind us that I can only love because Christ loved me. Yeah. And there isn't, it's always that way. And these revealed to us, these situations revealed to us our own character and our own reminders of how we're loved by God. And I think it's a good reminder to all of us, whether you decide to do foster care or not, that God loves you so much, and you can't love as much as God loves you. And he loves you. He's willing to die for you. And he desires a relationship with you. And that's a really helpful framing. And like, who am I to deny that love from other kids? That's what I struggle with personally. I mean, like as a man, and like I've done my part, or like I've got my own kids. Like, who are you, God? Like, seriously, like what else do you want from me? And like, yeah, but you know, I mean, I gave everything for you, and how much do you love me? How much do you trust me? I'm asking you to do this, so you need to obey. It's good for me. But I think that's an honest reminder.
Well, when you just said it's good for me, there is so much that God has taught me about how to love, the Christian journey, trust, that I would never have learned if I was not in the position to need it. And so I am so thankful for that. And for me, that's the definition of joy, is being at that place where I can say, I am so thankful for every experience I've had, every mistake I've made along the way. God has redeemed it. That's who God is. We're not perfect parents, and we know that, and our children certainly know that. But God redeems all of that, and he has taught me so much that I don't think I would have learned if I was living this nice little comfortable life with a house without holes and without needing to be on my knees saying, give me this love that I don't have today.
It's awesome.
Well, and that comfortable life isn't the life we're promised in Christ either.
Not, in fact, it's a job description I don't think anyone would answer.
Right.
With, I'm going to give you trials, and this is going to be difficult, and I'm sending you out like sheep among wolves. This is not the kind of job description that people answer, but it is the one that we're supposed to. And when we do, that's when we find this joy that I can't describe it.
Yeah.
But I wouldn't want to live without it at this point.
Yeah. And I just want to say, just as I know John's not here, but as a man, and I'm not pretending to be John, and John is so wise and so faithful to love others. But the thing I've learned to what you're saying is, I get to be part of rewriting a narrative, or at least contributing to a narrative of a healthy Heavenly Father love for these kids. And so many men are looking for significance, looking for like, what is my life for? What will my legacy be? And they're not always living in the now in the same way. And I have just found it such a great honor with my own kids and other people's kids, neighborhood kids, and kids who have come into our home, to say, wow, like, I know we talked about this earlier in the podcast. Like, I know I wanted to watch football today, and I was really sad that now we've got these kids coming. Like, how silly is that? Like, I don't even know, like, I don't even cheer for these teams. I can't tell you any player except for their quarterback. Like, but I wanted to spend my day doing that. Mm-hmm. And instead, I get to, be consistent and a stable force for this kid. And at the end of the day, like, was it hard? Sure. Mm-hmm. But was it rewarding? Absolutely. Mm-hmm. And even if it was just a couple days or a couple weeks or a couple months, I can't think of a better way to spend a life than saying, Lord, like, here I am, and the growth in me is not where it needs to be, but it's been way more than I would have gotten otherwise. And it's such a joy to help rewrite the narrative for a kid in ways that I might never get to know how that story turns out, as you said. But I get to go to bed knowing that, like, I gave a good day's effort for the glory of the Lord when that happens. And, no matter what we do with our lives, I think that's a good goal. Yes. And we always fall short of the mark. Yes. But it's a good reminder to frame our lives of they belong to the Lord's, and what are we willing to give Him. As you think about what is it that we can do now, like, what is the one thing we can do now? I think that's something that we'd love our listeners to think about. What do you feel God stirring in your heart? What about specifically? And just sit with that. Like, God, what do you want me to do now? What's my next step? What is the thing that you want to pray about for God to make a way for you to be obedient for that, and your church to do someday? Like, for you personally, for your church, what is that one thing? And again, it will look very different for you. It will look different for each of us. Mm-hmm. But I think if we're all asking, what is my one thing? And then we go and do that, have the courage to go and the joy to go and do that, we will have more than enough. Trent, our senior pastor, often says to me and others, if we're ready to serve God, we're late. And like, God doesn't ask me to be God. He asks me to be faithful. I've said that about 1,000 times during this podcast because it's my favorite line that I have to remind myself every day. God doesn't ask me to be God. He asks me to be faithful. I don't need to do all the things. What is the one faithful step today? And then tomorrow we'll worry about tomorrow. Right. But today, what is it? What is God asking you to do? And I don't want you to run by that, right? Our goal is not that this has been an interesting series of conversations for you to be entertained by. That's not our goal. And we really don't care. Honestly, we don't care about the answer. We care that you have been equipped to sit with an understanding of something happening in our region. That these kids that Cindy is talking about, these kids, these teens, these adults now, will be found by someone. It's possible they might make it, but it's likely they won't, absent healthy intervention. And it's possible your life will be harder, but it's likely that your life will be enriched by obeying God. And it's likely that you will plant seeds into the lives of kids to help them know that they are loved and valued by you and by the Lord. Whether you're a foster parent, whether you're a host parent, host family, a support team member, a guy who just comes over and quietly mows the neighbor's yard without them even knowing. Whatever your role is, or you're a person who's just praying faithfully day in and day out for the people that you know in your life, and you think that's the only thing you can do, and that is no small thing. We don't care. Honestly, I don't care what you do. What we do want you to do with all of this information is to sit now and in the days to come and say, Lord, here is my life. What is my next right step? And then know that we are praying for you to have the faith and the hope and the joy to do just that. And trust the God who made the heaven and the earth, the God who painted the part of the Red Sea, the God who made you will be with you and will watch over you wherever you go. And that's true for these kids who don't have a champion on earth that they know of, but maybe God is inviting you to say like, hey, I see you. You matter to God and to me. I wasn't planning on doing this, but God had other thoughts. And I want you to know that you're loved, you're seen, and you're valued. And so I'm coming. I'm changing my plans and I'm coming for you, because someone always finds vulnerable children. They're not alone very long. So let it be us. Nate, we always do takeaways, Cindy. What are your takeaways from our time with Cindy?
Yeah. I think one of the ones that has stuck out to me the most, like with our pre-production talk and just in this conversation, I think is the idea of asking ourselves what breaks your heart in this conversation. What breaks your heart? And like across these last 6 episodes, we've been, going at each level of the foster care crisis, and we just want our listeners to process through both what breaks your heart and what do you have to offer? What do you have to bring to the table? And I love the way that Cindy framed that earlier about just anything that you have to bring to the table can be redemptive in this story. It's just how is God calling you to use it? And so for our listeners, like I would love, it's probably helpful in this moment to take a step back and just lay out in front of yourself, in front of God, what have I been given? Both skill-wise, material-wise, all these things, and what is being used redemptively already, and is God calling me to change that or keep it the same, or is He calling me to use it in a new way? And then the other thing that really stuck with me, which you didn't say in our first conversation, but I really liked today, was, and I think you said that John said this, but trauma is the mission field of our time. I think that's a really powerful and true sentiment. And for our listeners, that's another thing that we want to really bring across through this interview is pay attention to the trauma around you and within you. It causes so much damage, and everyone deals with trauma in one way or another. And so our listeners, as you're listening, the traumas that you've dealt with. And we all need to go through a healing process with that, whether it's through counseling, whether it's just through really great friendships, and all those things alongside our relationship with God and letting Him be the ultimate healer, because that's who He is. But I just thought that was a really helpful framing for this conversation. And then this is just a side thing, but I think the King Zoo and the Funny Farm is it sounds like an indie rock band.
You'll have to check that out. You have to check out our blog. It's
now
brilliant.
we have to go
funny.
write some stuff.
Yeah, you will. But even you've given us a lot to read already. So yeah.
So over time, you've gone from the King Strings to an indie rock band. That's what's coming in the future for the King family, I foresee.
I like that. I like that. And,
what is your takeaway? Yeah,
for me, it's very similar to what Nate said. John's sign in his office, trauma is the mission field of our time. But I think that very early on in your comments, you essentially asked, like, what is your why? Like, what is the why we're here? What is the why we've been given all this stuff? Like, just asking, like, what's my why? Like, what's our family's why? What's my why? Like, why do I do any of this stuff? And I think I think this is of the Lord, as I've just been praying and listening to you, Cindy. I think that I'm encouraged to say to our listeners as we wrap up this episode about next step is, if you don't know step forward and find someone who is walking this journey and say, what can I do to help? If you don't know what your next step is, if you're not sure, because we're all called, don't be trapped waiting to figure it out alone and just step in, because we hear so consistently that the reason why people do step forward and why they stay in the game is they saw other foster families or other host families getting support. Like, they're not anymore imagining as like, how can I take care of this kid and welcome that kid into trauma into my home? It's how can we do this well? It changes the question. So as you're sensing and discerning what is your next step and you don't know, find a family in your church or in your neighborhood or in your school district that you know, or ask, what family can I support now? And then begin walking that journey, because we're all called to help. And so I don't think the right response is, well, I'm not sure, so I'm just going to wait. Because these kids need help now. I'm not saying that you should rush it. I am saying that we can learn through the doing, and the clarity comes from obedience and taking the next step of saying, like, here are these families. And so I have found it a great encouragement to hear from you on, like, what's my why, and then just to get going and not to force the issue, but to obey. We say to our kids, right? You can obey first and then we'll talk about it. We're not going to like go back and forth and then, we delay the obedience. You're going to obey first and then we'll talk about it. And I think that applies here in ways that I didn't realize until this conversation. So anything else you want to say to us? No pressure, but anything else you want to say to kind of wrap up this time?
Yeah, I think one thing I was thinking of, along with the what holds people back, and a lot of times I think for families it's concerns about their own children, and so I just wanted to address that.
Sure.
We have 9 children, but we started. We fostered before having biological children, and then we started back up again when we had 5 biological children. And from that point on, people have often asked the question about, what about the children?
Yep.
And I think my favorite question, because I've finally figured out how to answer it, is, aren't you afraid it's going to wreck your children? And I now say,
I get that.
Yes, it wrecked my children, but in the best possible ways. Like, it wrecked their sense of materialism, because there are so many things they didn't get. Or, people will often say, wow, you must have a really big house. No, we don't, actually, and it's probably smaller than yours. And so my children don't have that sense of, I have to have a room of my own. They would have loved to have had rooms of their own, I'm sure. But I've often said they probably were better college roommates without a room of their, not having had a room of their own, than I was, because I was the only girl who had a room of my own. So it's wrecked their sense of entitlement. It's wrecked their sense of complacency. They have learned in this day and age, when if you post something on social media, it's as if you've done something. They've learned that that's not the case, that you haven't done something until you've actually done something. Wow. And so there's so many things that they've learned. Not that that was easy. Yep. And there were times that they were not behind us. There were times that the chaos hurt them in ways that I wish it hadn't, that it got too close or it got too hurtful. But again, it taught them that God is there. And so there are so many things they've learned through the process too. So if that's the question that's holding you back, don't let that hold you back. Yes, we need to protect our children, but if we think we're going to protect them from everything, we're not. So I think the best way to teach them is to do, I've had parents say, yeah, well, we'll just read about it, or we'll talk to your family. That's great. But you're going to raise kids that are only good at reading about it or talking to other families about it. If we want to raise kids that are going to love and serve the Lord the way he's asked us to do it, they need to see us doing that. So I think taking those steps, trusting our children into God's care,
Amen,
is the best way to do it. Jump off the cliff. He will take care of them just as he'll take care of us.
I'm sure my parents were going through a lot of the same thing as my sister is adopted. I don't know if I mentioned that earlier, but of thinking through what that was going to affect me and my brother. And I wouldn't be sitting at this table today if it weren't for them taking that step and taking her in. And our family has changed for the better. And I don't know what my family would look like without my sister and our family. So I'm deeply grateful, and I relate a lot to what you're saying. So
Yeah, we are so thankful, Cindy, for your time, and not just your time with this podcast, but your investment in the West Shore Free Church foster community.
Yeah.
Cindy's on our leadership team, even though she doesn't go to our church. Like, this is just the way that she loves so generously. And you have just been such a beacon of truth and guidance and honesty about your own doubts, your own fears. And you showed us how to love well, but love honestly and in community, and to receive love and to give love. And that's just a really hopeful and helpful example for us. And just again, a plug, we do this foster care Zoom sessions that we mentioned. Those are going to be in the show notes. We'll resume. They go in 8-week cycles, and then we give it a little break because you need a break from Zoom. We do too. And so you can find those in the show notes. Anyone who's listening would be welcome to join those. It's for the region, not just our church. We have people joining from all over because you don't need to do this alone. And, we have said all throughout this podcast, just as we wrap this up, we have said throughout this podcast that there's a lot of challenges that have no earthly solutions. And the foster care crisis doesn't need to be one of them. It does seem so overwhelming, with over 400,000 kids around the country who have been removed from their homes by a court of law because they're too dangerous. And there's a wider list than that of kids who probably should be removed, but there's no other places for them to go. So they're staying in places that are harmful for them mentally, spiritually, sexually, physically, all of the things, because there's not enough people to provide safe and secure places for them to live and grow and thrive. And that's a problem. Yet we believe, and the Christian Alliance for Orphans and More Than Enough campaign believe, that we can have more than enough. And so while this nationwide crisis is rampant and it is concerning, we believe that it's not only possible but likely that we can have more than enough families if all of us are just willing to ask the question, what is God asking of me? And that's what we'd invite you as we close down to ask, what is the Lord asking of me? What is the Lord asking of my family? What is the Lord asking of my life group or my community group? What is the Lord asking of my church?
Yeah.
And we might not get to know how that plays out, and what we think that answer is might be different in the end. But we first ask, what is the Lord requiring of me? And then to say yes and amen. Yes and amen. And I promise you, friends, I promise you, I am living testimony of this too. I promise you that the story that God will write in you and through you and despite you will be greater if you ask that, instead of like, there's got to be more than life than this, which is how many of us are living right now. And we just want to say thank you for joining us, and thank you for investing your hearts and your time. And we are here with you. PossibleandLikely.com is filled with resources, and there'll be more to come, I'm sure. But we just want you to know that as you're praying, we are praying for you. And we will be with you, praying for you, even if we don't know you. And please check out the show notes for ways that we can help you. And let us know if there's other ways that you don't find there that you need help. We do not want to call you into this and not help you. And we pray that that's true for you and your neighbors, your community groups, your life groups, your churches. And that is definitely true for us. We love you. We're praying for you. And thanks for listening.